Hello, Kaz.
Hi,
Hello to
David.
you all. I am David Diniz. I'm a deputy director of Portuguese newspaper Expresso, as you might know. Welcome to this Lisbon Speed Talk. First of all, let me thank Mr. Kazmood on behalf of the Lisbon Club, and of course, to thank Lisbon Club's invitation for this very special invitation. I say special because our guest today is one of the leading political scientists exploring populism. Kazmood, as you all know, is a Dutch political scientist who focuses on political extremism and populism, mostly in Europe and in the United States. He is a professor of international affairs at the University of Georgia, also at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. Among other, he is the author of The Far Right Today, a book that I have here besides me and that I bought as soon as it got out in the US, and that is already translated into Portuguese, and I strongly recommend you to read. His research includes the areas of political parties, extremism, democracy, civil society, and European politics. Mr. Kazmood, I should tell you, will have a few words, but I must say to you that you can send me some questions through Lisbon Club's Facebook and from our page at YouTube. I'll make sure Mr. Kazmood gets them. I shall say no more. Kaz, the ground is, of course, yours. I should ask you to tell us about populism, why and where is it surging? And if I might ask you this, does Mr. Trump defeat mean that this movement is turning back, or should we be cautious and standing by?
Yes, thanks to the Lisbon Club for having me, and thanks, David, for this very kind introduction. Let me go very quickly through what populism is and kind of where we stood and stand. So populism is an ideology which pretty much sees society as ultimately divided between two homogenous and antagonistic groups, the pure people on the one hand and the corrupt elite on the other, and that wants politics to be the expression of the volonté générale, or the general will of the people. Now, populism in itself can be combined with other ideologies, and in almost all cases, serious populist actors, be they politicians or parties, combine populism with another ideology. By and large, nativism or xenophobic nationalism on the right, and some type of socialism on the left. For quite a while, socialism, let's say 1990s to early 2000s, populism was successful both on the left and the right, with overall the right being more successful in the north and both of Europe and of the Americas, and the left populism more successful in the south. Again, think about Greece, think about Spain, Syriza Podemos, but also think about Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. Now, over the last 5 years, particularly since Brexit and Trump in 2016, when we talk about populism, we almost exclusively talk about right-wing populism. And I would say, prefer actually to use the term the far right. And so that is point one. Actually, where we stand today is left-wing populism is very, very small and very marginal. Podemos is in the government, but has moderated, particularly its populism. Syriza has significantly moderated its whole political agenda. Most of the regimes in Latin America are pretty much either gone or struggling. And so what we're really talking about when we talk about populism at the moment is the populist radical right, and they are still very much alive. Sure, Trump is gone, and that is not insignificant, because in the end, despite your views towards the US, the American president is still the most visible and powerful democratically elected person in the world. And the fact that a radical right politician could get to that position was a major inspiration for many far right parties across the world. It also helped mainstream and normalize them. Like you can say, if you're saying something that is seen as out of bounds, but the president of the United States says it too, right? You can say, look, this is actually not that abnormal. This is not something that can't be said by Democrats. So in that sense, it's important. Is it important in another sense? Not really. Trump never invested in any connections really with other far-right leaders. Despite all of the conspiracy theories in the media about Steve Bannon, his so-called the movement never really took off, was completely irrelevant. And at the same time, it was never really important because the far right was already successful within Europe well before Trump. And in the end, like one of the things we focus on global trends, and they are important, but elections are national. And if you want to understand why populists win in a specific election, you should look at that country rather than someone else. The Dutch are not going to vote for or against Wilders in the next election because Trump won or lost. Right? They do that for Dutch reasons. And the Portuguese situation is the same.
Okay, Kaz, let me ask you this. The latest world economical crisis gave ground for a surge of populist leaders and parties in all over Europe, or in some parts of Europe, I should say. Some of them got elected and now are or were heads of governments. I would like to ask you if you think that this pandemic, with its economical and social crisis, can give ground to the empowerment of this kind of parties, movements, or leaders?
Yeah, so there is a received wisdom that the Great Recession gave this massive push to populism. And I mean, empirically, that's not completely true. They did go up, but they didn't go up that much. I mean, around a third probably. There were also not so many new populist parties that emerged because of the economic crisis, but of course, two of them gained a lot of attention. I mean, again, Syriza and Podemos. But interestingly enough, left-wing populism across the rest of Europe barely profited. Right-wing populism, or the far right more broadly, overall stayed roughly the same. The biggest push actually came from the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, not the Great Recession. What we see actually across time is that economic crises do not have that effect that we often think it has. Our interpretation of economic crisis means rise of populism is actually based on one case, which is the Weimar Republic. And so the Great Depression led to Hitler. And although there's a lot to be said about that, the Great Depression was at best one of the cases. One of the other things to note is that Hitler was the exception. Actually, in most countries, there were not many democratic countries, of course, at that time, but in most of the democratic countries at that time, fascist parties didn't win much. So economic crisis doesn't necessarily lead directly to, let's say, an anti-system response. In fact, actually, the response is quite often delayed. During the economic crisis itself, most people will vote on the basis of socioeconomic issues, and they will still trust kind of the established parties. But once it settles down, the dust settles, there tends to be kind of a reckoning. I mean, then people feel that they can take more of a risk, and they want to punish the guys who brought them here. And so I expect that. I don't expect a quick rise in the coming few years, but there is a good chance that in 5 years, they will win again.
Let me just say, Kaz, to our listeners that they can put some questions to you through our social networks, both on Facebook or in YouTube, and I'll make sure that I'll get them to you, and both in Portuguese or in English if they want. I'll translate them right away. For now, I might ask you this. What, having studied all these movements throughout these years, which factors should we be looking at to signalize or to be alert for the rise of populist parties, which are most delicate right now?
Well, I think that to me, the key reason why we see the rise of populism, and again, mostly in the shape of the far right these days, has to do with two things. First of all, it's a structural change. I mean, very simply put, actually, citizens have become more like citizens. They have become more independent. They have become more self-confident as democratic actors. And as a consequence, they've become more critical of their leaders. And so one of the arguments that you often see as well, our politicians are just bad these days. And if we would still have whatever, Willy Brandt or whomever else from the past, right, everything would be good. I mean, most of these people were pretty arrogant, were very elitist, detached from reality, and would have been killed in today's social media environment. Right? It is just much harder these days as a politician because relationships have become more horizontal.
Mm-hmm.
You can't keep any information from the people, right? So, and that is not changing, obviously. On the other hand, within that setting, over the last, I would say, 3-4 decades, we have seen what I've referred to as undemocratic liberalism, which is mostly related to the so-called neoliberal era. But what it means is that in the name of liberalism, be it cultural or economic, more and more important political decisions have been depoliticized. They have been taken out of the realm of particularly national politics. For example, by making them a legal affair and therefore to the courts, by putting them in central banks or other independent organizations, or by moving them up to Europe. And in addition to that, we have increasingly a non-ideological discourse where arguments are no longer we should do this because this brings us to this world vision, but there is no alternative, or TINA politics. We have to do this because the EU tells us this, or because globalization. And so I think those are the most important things. In today's world, you have to be more convincing than you used to be, because people don't vote for you anymore because they're a worker or because they're religious. They vote for you because you convince them that you have a better vision than your competitor.
That's interesting. I should ask you about the Portuguese reality. I think you might know a bit of it. As you know, Kaz, here in Portugal, we have a new party. It has no more than 1 year and a half. And this party has been classified as a populist or as a far-right party. Its leader, André Ventura, got 11% in the latest presidential election. Looking at what happened in Europe and in the US, what would be your advice to the traditional parties?
Well, I'm already too late because Chega has already entered coalitions, at least at support parties, at the regional level. And to a certain extent has had this electoral breakthrough, not so much in the parliamentary elections, but in the presidential elections. And all the attempts to kind of ostracize a party pretty much only work if you do that before they break through. As soon as they become really big, there's a significant support base and they're going to question your decision. On top of that, there's an electoral incentive, particularly for mainstream right-wing parties, to at least not, let's say, externalize their ideas, because they want their electorate in the time that they might implode. Now, I think if I compare Portugal to Spain, for example, I think there's a very important difference. I mean, in one way, they're very similar. They have a very late breakthrough of the radical right, and a very fast normalization and mainstreaming of it. Like within 2 years, pretty much, they are already supporting governments at the local and regional level. However, Vox is actually a well-organized party, which is not fully dependent upon its leader. Vox comes out of the PP and has a lot of an infrastructure. Chega doesn't have that, and is very much based on its leader, the leader who seems to be reasonably volatile. And what we learn is that these type of leaders can rise very fast, but parties that are very much based on a leader can also disappear quicker. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that the support for his policies disappears, right? Mm-hmm. But it does mean that as a political force, he is more dependent upon other people doing the work for him, which mostly means mainstream journalists and mainstream politicians, than by the organization itself. And so I would imagine that Chega doesn't do particularly well in the local elections. And actually, I would even imagine that they do less well in the next parliamentary elections, because on average, and this is not a law, but on average, leaders of far-right parties do better in presidential elections than their parties do in parliamentary elections.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I have one more question about Mr. Ventura, if you asking your advice on Mr. Ventura concerning the media. As you might know, I'm particularly concerned with that, but I have also one of our listeners questioning it. What would be your advice to the media concerning this?
Well, I think, look, there are a lot of different things here. First of all, you shouldn't make it disproportionate. Yes, Ventura is the story because you don't have a radical right before, right? And as a consequence, that is more important than something else. At the same time, he's a minority player. Right? You can look at the last presidential elections in two ways. You can look at it from the perspective of Ventura, or you can look at it from the perspective that the sitting president has been returned with almost 2/3 of the support, right? Which is a very, very solid performance of a sitting politician during a crisis, right? So that will be my focus. For me, Ventura is the side story, which would, first of all, means that if anyone has kind of played with Ventura because it might get some readers and they thought he's harmless, right? That stage should now be over. Clearly, Ventura is a potential player and he should be covered, but not disproportionately. I also honestly think that media that consider themselves watchdogs of the democracy should treat parties that are anti-democratic, and more specifically anti-liberal democratic, differently than those that support liberal democracy. And you should always be critical, like also to politicians that you do like, but you should definitely contextualize Ventura to make clear that he is not the same type of politician. He stands for a fundamentally different type of political system in which minority rights, rule of law, separation of powers are being threatened. And so I think contextualizing and not overselling his importance are the most important things.
Mm-hmm. Professor, you have told us that Syriza and Podemos have moderated their populism through the late years. Do you think that we can expect the radical right to do the same as they get to power? Of course, I'm also concerned looking at what might happen in Portugal. If, as you said, the new party has been brought to a regional coalition in some ways. Do you think that bringing in this party to power might put him softer?
So all research shows that doesn't happen in the case of the radical right. Now, what is important is that in some cases, specifically the populism moderated, in the sense that they would now mostly limit the elite to the left or centrist and take out the parties they governed with. And I think to a certain extent, the Danish People's Party was a very good example where the populism really increasingly became secondary. But the nativism, the xenophobic nationalism didn't moderate in any way, right? And that we see exactly the same. They remain as Eurosceptic by and large. They remain as nativist. They remain as authoritarian. So it on the basis of the last 3 decades, like there's very little indication that the radical right also moderates, but the mainstream left and didn't bend with the left populist, whereas the
Mhm.
mainstream right has bended with the right-wing populist. So there is no incentive to moderate. They don't need to, because actually the mainstream right has moved closer to them. And one of the responses of that is that they actually sometimes move further right to distinguish themselves from the mainstream right.
Okay, that's a good answer. Uh, Jan Sauerborn, one of our listeners, is asking how important is it to view nativism and populism as two separate categories? Is this distinction real? Or can you elaborate on this divide a bit?
Yeah, I think it's crucial. Populism is about a vertical distinction within the same ethnic group, and it's between the people on the top and the elite at the bottom, right? The moral people on the top and the corrupt elite at the bottom. Nativism is about a horizontal
Mhm.
differentiation between our ethnic group here and their ethnic group there. And so
Mhm.
they're about very different groups. Like populism is not about the Muslims taking over. Like populism is about other Portuguese or other Dutch betraying us Portuguese or us Dutch. And we have nativist parties that are not populist. We have populist parties that are not nativist. So while at the moment, because the populists are mostly on the far right, most populist actors are also nativist. This is not necessarily the case. And again, Latin America, most of these parties were not nativist
Mhm.
at all.
Very well. Pedro Monjardino, one of our other listeners, is asking a curious question. As you know, the Socialist Party in Portugal is governing with the support of two left-wing parties. One of them is a communist party. The other is some kind of a Syriza-like party, is Bloco de Esquerda. Do you believe, he asks, that since no major problem has taken place in Portugal, that some people might think that with this Chega, with this new Ventura party, that is feasible to expect the same in supporting a government? And I should add a new question on top of it. Do you think that if the right wing traditional parties bring Chega to a future government, that they would lose strength with it? Is it expectable that, seeing what happened in other places in Europe, that the traditional parties might win or rather lose with the inclusion of these parties in government?
Yeah, starting with the second question, which is first related. We see both happening, and both have happened. It depends a lot on how, particularly, the populist radical right party behaves. And
Mm-hmm.
in that case, a party like Chega, which is very much based on one person, is always a liability. Whereas a political party like Vox, for example, which again, most of its elite come out of the mainstream parties, have political experience at the local level, there's a much better chance that they will be a more stable coalition partner. Much depends on how the government works. But even then, look at Kurz in Austria, who worked together with the FPÖ, which was a disastrous choice, as everyone could have seen. The FPÖ tries to undermine democracy through the Minister of Interior, then gets caught trying to sell access to an alleged Russian businessman while the leader does coke in a video. Like, and you would think, like, well, Kurz has to pay the price now because he brought this band of like criminals into the coalition, and he doesn't. He picks up most of the votes from the radical right, right? Whereas in other cases, everyone is punished. There is no general rule. I think it has a lot to do with how the mainstream party behaves and how the radical right party behaves. Now, the Portuguese case is very intriguing. To be honest, I don't know too much about it because Portugal is incredibly little covered in English language literature, even by left-wing outlets that I would read. But what it does show is that I think that the so-called the far left has in the last couple of years been willing to compromise. I also think it shows that the mainstream left has very clearly set standards of we will only collaborate within these limits. Of course, the EU pushed them to do this as well. And this hasn't happened towards the radical right. And if the mainstream right would do that and say we are willing to work with you, but we have to stick within liberal democracy, and these are red flags, right? Then it might still lead to a very right wing but still liberal democratic government. And I think that has happened less.
Pretty interesting. We don't have much time left, but I'll try to put two more questions if I might. The first of all is it comes from Sofia Souza, and she asks, "What do you think that the future post-populism movement will be, or even worse, will democracy as we know it be affected? Will it survive?"
Yeah, I don't see why. I mean, I know that over the last 4 or 5 years, it has been particularly popular and I would say profitable to predict the end of democracy and the end of liberalism. And now we had 4 years of which the most powerful person in the world was far right and clearly not concerned with liberal democracy. And the institutional damage that Trump has done to either US democracy or world democracy has been marginal. Most of the damage is actually done at national levels. Now, there is serious damage done, most notably in Hungary, with the tacit support and subsidies of the EU. The fact that
Poland
Orban,
also.
right, and the fact that Orban just got out of the European People's Party doesn't change that at all. But I think overall, the state of liberal democracy in most countries is still pretty good. It might have been a bit better 2 decades ago. I'm not even sure about that. But the liberal democracy is still pretty good. It never was perfect. And that is the thing. Like, we shouldn't try to go back to a golden era because the golden eras were always pretty marginal. They were marginal in terms of the rights of women. They were marginal in the terms of LGBTQ rights. And so I see liberal democracy as a continuing process that has to be developed more and more. And I don't necessarily see that this isn't going to happen in the future.
Okay, Kaz, I think we still have time for one more. Again, from Sophia, this should be good to end this conversation today. What do you think that a citizen can actually do to fight populism in some ways?
Well, I think humility is a good start. Acknowledging that, like, it's not. We have a lot of anti-populism these days, particularly among the better educated, either centrist or leftist people, where the argument is, well, we are very well informed, and that's why we make good decisions, and they only believe like disinformation and fake news, and that's why they make dumb decisions, right? Or we vote with the head and they vote with the heart, and this is just not true. Like, I mean, if you, for example, look at people who support Europe over people who are against Europe, it's not necessarily that the people who support Europe are better informed about it. So we're not necessarily that different. A lot of us vote on the basis of, in a sense, very simplistic images and information, as well as an emotional vote. I think that's a very important start. The second is you can't really change people's minds by having a purely factual discussion, because facts have become political, and your facts come from a source that the other one doesn't acknowledge, and vice versa. Right? What we know from I mean, pretty much persuasion is that, first of all, persuasion only really happens when the other person trusts you. And so I think to me, and I struggle with this as well, because I live in Trump's America, right? I mean, I live in the South, and the majority of, well, not anymore, but a lot of people here vote for Trump, including my neighbor. And how do you deal with that? I think it's important that you don't dehumanize people, and that you also don't completely externalize them from your life. At the same time, I think it's also important that you don't give in everything. Like, I mean, one of the things, and I found this myself, when I would fly before COVID, like, I would sit next to someone and they would start to talk about Obama at that point in time, and they just throw in all kind of like weird stuff, like that he was very anti-Israel and against white people. And I would be like, I would just not say anything, right? Because I don't need that. I'm just flying from A to B. I don't need to get into that discussion. And at the same time, I think we have done that too long, because even that silence confirms for these people that they're right. So we need to find that balance. And I think that is, I think that is the first thing. But I also think that we should make our story stronger. We should make our liberal democratic story stronger, rather than just always respond to the populist critiques. And if we're honest, I think Christian Democrats, liberals, social democrats, and even Greens have less and less of a coherent ideological story of how we should deal with the 21st century and all of the challenges. And so I think if we invest in that, we are much better prepared to have that fundamental conversation with those who challenge us.
Kaz, thank you for all. It was a huge pleasure to have you with us. I hope you can come to Lisbon as soon as the vaccination process goes on, for you in the US as for us in Portugal. It's been a pleasure again. Thank you for all, and for who has been listening to us. Again, thank you, and have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks. Thanks.
Bye.